Welcome to Let's Actuate. We're all about meaningful conversations with inspiring change makers. Today, we're excited to hang out with Angely Mercado, an award winning journalist, researcher, and fact checker, which I think is so cool, who's nailed the art of exploring the intersection of environmental justice, racial justice, sustainability, fintech, and culture. You probably spotted her in articles in top publications like the New York Times, Vogue, Teen Vogue, The Guardian, Rolling Stone, Grist, The Nation, Vice, CNBC, and more. So join us as we explore Angeli's fascinating journey together. So, I probably just spoke too fast because this is my first interview that I'm doing with someone and I'm nervous. So, hopefully, you got all of that. And now that I've introduced you, from your perspective, what is important for strangers to know about you?
Well, thank you for introducing me, first off.
Of
And
course.
I guess, second of all, one of the most important things when it comes to people learning about me as a climate and science writer is that I learned on the job. And I used to be so intimidated by other reporters, or especially reporters who are in kind of like the business space, tech, or science or climate, when I was reading their stories and thinking, like, I wish I could be in that space, is so many of them also just kind of learned off the cuff. They were learning while they were reading, learning while they were reporting, learning while they were putting themselves out there. So I sometimes get questions where people are like, did you study science? Did you study environmental science or just anything to do with climate and sustainability? And the answer is no. I learned on the job, and I hope that that makes it more approachable for people who are learning about my work or reading my work.
That's awesome. Do you have like any advice for like how did you get started in this?
Journalism and I have been in a long relationship. Like I was a student in high school, like writing for the school newspaper because I thought it was interesting. And my first paid internship, I was in college and I was reporting in the South Bronx. And I think an important thing to know is I was born, raised, and still live in New York City, specifically in the borough of Queens. And I really liked reading newspapers. I liked watching the news with my family. My dad encouraged me to read a lot and to learn about politics. And it was just like a big part of my life where it was encouraged by my family constantly. And I didn't realize at the time that environmental themes were always part of my life. I just didn't always recognize it that way yet, or I didn't have the vocabulary to explain it yet. But like the South Bronx has a lot of pollution issues and a lot of like environmental racism issues. Queens, at least where I went to high school, the area is called Long Island City. You can see the peaking plants, like the smokestacks, from my old high school. And so a lot of my classmates, a lot of people I went to school with and grew up with, had pretty bad asthma. And this was exacerbated by the air pollution that we were around. I don't know how I don't have asthma. I don't have a lot of respiratory issues that are like chronic, like somebody else, like other people around me have. But I started to see a pattern. And over time, other climate issues came into play for me. Whereas I was here during Hurricane Sandy, I had to get to school, I had to get to work. And so I had to walk so many blocks, take a bus with one of my siblings to find the F train to go into Manhattan because the L train and the M train were not functioning. My family is also from the Caribbean. And so everywhere I'm from, everywhere I spend most of my time is an island and sea level rise. So when I realized that, sea level rise became so much more real for me just as an individual and as somebody who is thinking about like how's this affecting my family, how's this affecting my community. And that eventually led to environmental reporting because I started off as a community reporter and writing general stories, writing essays online, publishing like topics that I thought were interesting for myself, learning about like podcasting. For a while, I just kind of floundered around because I didn't have a lot of mentors or, and journalism is a hard industry. It's very competitive. And so I had a few lost years here and there. And then I became an intern at The Nation magazine where I learned about fact checking and started covering climate, sustainability, and environmental justice more intentionally. And I think that's kind of what led to the redirection of being where I am now.
That's awesome. I think it's so admirable that you're using your voice in this way and you've seen patterns of different climate issues and racial issues and seeing how deeply it affects people and their health and now you're using your voice and your platform to amplify that. I think that's awesome. A big reason why I wanted to bring you on was because like I always tell myself in a past life, like I was meant to be not even maybe in a past life, in a parallel universe,
Mhm.
I would have gotten a degree in like horticulture
Oh,
because I love the environment and I love to work with plants and learn more about that. Now, right now, I am, doing what I do now with design and helping to build businesses. And I just think it's so awesome and amazing that people step into this space and are making a huge impact. So that's awesome.
thanks.
So, another thing that is something that we talked about the last time that we spoke was now that you're in this space of journalism, there is like these gaps between, the way that information is shared and what people don't know by the way that information shared. I know that like when I talk to my friends and different articles are brought up, it's hard to know like what is the truth or not. And I know that
Mhm.
you also mentioned that you're a fact checker. Like like how does someone even get into that? What even is a fact? How you're just like this is the truth?
Mhm. I mean, I got into fact checking through the internship at The Nation, and there are a lot of publications, podcasts, and magazines where if they're using a lot of information, a lot of like dense information, they usually contract someone, or some places have on staff teams of fact checkers where they get a draft and they have to go through every single detail and make sure that as much of it is correct as possible. Like things fall through the cracks, like things happen, or so, like information changes depending on the situation. But you are helping the magazine present the most accurate that they can put out there. It also prevents lawsuits because if you
Mm,
get certain things wrong because this is about someone's business or someone's life, they could threaten to sue.
mm,
And a lot of it is like keep up the dignity and the respect of the publication, avoid lawsuits, and avoid just like stupid miscommunications that sometimes happen just because, people are talking to each other and things get scrambled. And so we're kind of like, I would say, almost like the safety net for some of it. And for example, like what are like when you ask like, what is a fact, it could be something as simple as a sentence will say this event happened on Tuesday and then the date. You have to make sure, is that the correct event? Did they mean to put that very specific event?
mm,
Is that date actually on a Tuesday? And is that the correct date? And then sometimes you have to ask the writer, like, send me all of your documents. I have to look at them. Send me all of your transcripts. I have to look at them. And so there have been times when the majority of the article, the draft is right, but like little things are wrong because it's like, oh, this date isn't a Tuesday, that's a Thursday. This event is spelled differently because this was translated from another language.
mm,
It's a lot of different things that kind of get lost in the shuffle of different editors. So having kind of like that process of we're going to pause for this week and several people including the fact checker are going to make sure it's all there, like it's as correct as possible, it does stop publications for putting stuff out there that's like factually incorrect.
mm. Now, is there like levels to fact checking? Because I know that you bring up like verifying dates and times and events. What about the deeper fact checking of like ideas and knowledge? Like I guess specifically within like science.
It's a lot of looking at documents. It's a lot of looking
Mm,
at studies, calling the scientists that wrote the study and being like, can you explain the abstract to me? Do I know what I'm talking about? Do I know what I'm looking at? And sometimes just going over information with sources, even just based on their personal experience, just being like, is this the accurate representation of what you experienced? This paragraph that we have here describes that you said XYZ, but they paraphrased it. So is
mm,
this summary accurate to you? And the same thing with like anything scientific, it's like when the writer puts something together, what is their source? I need to see their sources. What studies did they look at? Who did they interview? are the people that they interviewed like well known in their field, or are they actually in that field and they're reputable? Can I easily search them online so it's like, yes, this person has spoken about this topic many times? So yeah, so there's different levels to it. Some publications don't need a very deep dive, and some do.
Mm-hmm.
And I recently did a fact check where I'm looking at like revenue from states based off of like specific like things that they're able to do with the land that a university owns, or land that an entity owns. And so it's the writer would reach out to these agencies and he's like, these are the numbers I found on public record. Tell me if they're correct or not. And then he would forward it to me and be like, this is what they said. So it would be like both of us looking at it and making sure we understood it correctly.
Mm-hmm. That's so cool that you're like just calling up scientists and be like, is this true?
Some of them are so nice. Like they really they fangirl so hard about like certain topics, and it's the best. Like some experts really are so generous with their time, and it's so rewarding to speak with them.
Oh my gosh, yes. There's this other cool podcast, not to like drop podcasts on a podcast. This is so meta that I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's called like Ologies. And
I think so.
they just talk to different scientists, and I'm so inspired by that podcast and the format of that podcast, because she just asks all these questions. So that's where I'm getting my inspo, to just like ask questions that, you know, maybe people don't understand about the whole field of journalism, and like what goes into and what affects all of it.
Yeah.
So yes, I love that. Especially more on the fact checking stuff. Right now, we're in a space where there's so much information out there, and even for me on a personal level, trying to figure out the best ways that I can live my life to counteract climate change and
Mhm.
a deep understanding of the choices that I make. How do you go about, and like what is like your take and opinion on where can we start? Is that something that you believe is in the power of the individual? Is that in the power of bigger and greater entities?
I think it's all of the things need to happen. The individuals need to look at their habits,
Mm-hmm.
and overconsumerism is rampant in wealthier countries, larger countries like the US, and
Mm-hmm.
parts of, I guess, what we would consider quote unquote the Western world.
Yeah.
But then, yes, agencies have to change, government agencies have to change, major businesses have to change how they do their business. Wealthy people need to have certain regulations on things like private jets, because like a commercial flight full of regular people and they're all together like hundreds of people, or like at least more than,
At Taylor Swift.
yeah, it's like, I do think she's a great artist, but it's, we have to be honest that like me taking a few commercial flights a year probably is like creating fewer emissions than somebody taking private jets. There is a big difference. Somebody who lives a regular life in an apartment or a smaller house is creating far fewer emissions than one wealthy person who owns multiple cars, multiple homes, multiple properties, because all of the energy that it takes to clean, to maintain, to power all of those things is so much more than the average family by themselves can make in a year.
Mm-hmm. And are there any firms or solutions that you think would help within engaging the public that you've seen that can make a big impact, or you think that somewhere like needs to change?
I definitely think system changes are necessary to engage people more, because I see the discourse online. There's no real ethical consumption under late stage capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
So why does me as an individual, why do I have to change so much? Because we have put the onus on average regular people a lot, versus the agencies and the industries that are polluting the most and contributing the most. I think people would be more incentivized to change certain habits if systems could change as well. If we saw like a will to change across systems. And I think part of it is also just elaborating that any action is better than no action. It doesn't have to be perfect. Like if there's something you did, like if you shopped a lot, growing up or use a lot of fast fashion and now you're like phasing out of it, even just doing it slightly less is better than not stopping at all.
Mm-hmm.
So I think sometimes people feel judged or like I have to do it perfectly or not at all. Like, no, do it imperfectly. Start somewhere, start at your comfort level, and consider that sustainability also means use what you already own. It's not buying like eco friendly tools or like bamboo toothbrushes. If the toothbrush you have right now is good and you can still use it, don't just throw it away. If the things you have right now are still good, keep using them for as long as you can, for as long as you can safely use them. And in the future, and if you want to replace with something that's more eco friendly or long lasting, sure. But for now, if it's in good condition, don't throw it away.
True. Yeah, I think that is a great answer. And then what do you do personally? Like, how is your background and everything that you know? Like, how does it affect your decisions that you make in your daily life?
Well, I moved into this apartment that I'm in at the end of February last year. Most of it is furnished with secondhand stuff. And just like I have not bought very many things completely new, a lot of it has been used. You'd be surprised how many of your relatives have a random set of plates that they just have not used. They got them because they were on sale at a department store like Macy's. They're nice plates. And so they're like, here, do you want these? And sure, free plates. Like you, like just talking to people and letting them know, like, oh, I have this stuff that I want to donate. Do you want to come look at anything? Do you want anything? Joining online groups where you can just kind of say in your neighborhood, like, I put this box of stuff out. Does anybody want it? I'm donating it. Just kind of, I'm throwing away fewer things and trying to give items a second life or give it to anyone in my community that could probably use it. Maybe I don't like it. Maybe the thing I got is too small or too big, or the shoes, like, I don't, they were a gift and maybe they don't suit me or they're like the wrong size. It's like, don't throw stuff out, return it, cycle it to someone else, donate it to someone else. I also just like, I do eat less meat. That one isn't hard because I'm not the biggest fan of like most red meats or anything anyway. So if that's something that somebody can implement, that's cool. If for cultural or financial reasons they can't, also don't feel judged, because I'm in a position where I can afford other things and I live walking distance from so many supermarkets that offer me options. I know that not everybody does.
Yeah.
So I think I look at what are my options financially, socially, geographically, and I work my way out from there, because I know that doing some of the things I do isn't possible for some of the other people that are maybe reading my work or drawing advice from someone like myself.
Mm. Awesome. Love to hear the meat part. I'm a vegan, so I'm biased and being like, yes.
It's so what that one wasn't hard. I just don't like the textures of most meats. Honestly, like red meat, I'm not the biggest fan. Growing up, I had to be convinced to eat it as a kid. I also met a cow when I was visiting my family in Puerto Rico who was really nice. And I was like, this is where like beef comes from.
Yeah.
I was like, I can't, nah, no. So
I know.
same thing with pork. I was like, I'm just not going to eat it anymore.
Yeah. They say that cows have a similar brain to dogs. Like they
Yeah.
want to cuddle with you. And I'm like, oh my God.
Yeah, and this cow's name was Lolita, and she knew her name, and she just liked to chill. And I'm like, I can't eat beef anymore. Can I? Like, no, can't. The few times that I've had any red meat in the past few years was because there's specific dishes from the Caribbean that it's like, I haven't had this in 3 years, so I just want one for Christmas. But for the most part, I would say a lot of my diet is plant based. And whenever I can afford to, I try to find like markets that are like, this is locally, this is from farmers in upstate New York.
Yeah.
So it's not traveling long distances, so fewer emissions.
Mm-hmm.
But I can sometimes afford to do that. I have the location privilege and some of the financial privilege, depending on the time of the year, to like go to places where I can do that. And I think it's different for everyone. If someone's like, for, like if someone's indigenous and certain like ways of cultivating meat is just what's available for them, particularly people, for example, in the Arctic, supermarkets are expensive. How do you survive the winter? You have to go hunting. Like whenever someone is like, do this for the planet, we're talking about people who have the options. Like I'm also specifically talking about people who have the options. So I think people can look at what is possible for them. I look at what's possible for me and work my way up from there. Go to another supermarket, then what can you do within your location to just lower your waste? Like think about other angles of your life where you could lower that.
Mhm. And I'm so happy that you're bringing up the topic of privilege and having the means to like do all of these things, because I think it's so true, and like the reality of the situation that, we have all of this information, and like, when you talk to, someone who is on the internet, like they know that climate change and like this is real, but they, may not have the means to make the choices because it's really expensive to like try to live as sustainably as possible.
Yeah, it's even things like since I've always been in New York City, public transportation has been my main mode of transportation. I have never owned a car because I've never had to, whereas I visit family outside of New York City. There aren't even really sidewalks in some of their communities. There something could be less than half a mile away, and my siblings and I would be like, "Oh, let's walk." They're like, "No, there's no sidewalk. You have to get into the car to go there."
Mm.
And so it's like people want to do the right thing, but there isn't always a way to do it. So it's more like, can you carpool? Can you maybe kind of do a lot of your errands in one day so you're not constantly getting in and out of a car? It's just what is available to you, because this country is not set up for public transit, or like mass transit across like the entire country is hard. So what is in your neighborhood? What is available to you? What can you actually change for yourself? But apart from that, I would like people to feel less guilt, because I think the guilt stops you from actually taking action because you think it has to be this huge grandiose like gesture, but it really doesn't have to be.
Yeah, it's like letting go of the story that you're telling yourself on like, I have to be like 0 or 100.
Yeah, exactly.
Mhm. And I think it's becoming more prevalent in like everyday conversation because now climate change, like we can't escape it. Like everyone is feeling it. And
Mhm.
I know that you have written articles on it as well, on, you know, for years and years, like from your background, from where you're from, and like what you've noticed um, from your family in Puerto Rico, that climate change has been a thing that people in other countries have been dealing with forever, and they know it, and now it's coming here. So
Yeah, and for some people it's been here. It's just harder, I think, now for wealthier people to escape some of it. And I think that's why we have some of the awareness that we have, because frontline communities have existed for some time, like particularly black and brown frontline communities, indigenous communities, communities where people are just poor and maybe don't have access to the most stable housing, have always felt the brunt for the last few decades. Maybe we had less vocabulary to express that, less social media to portray, like, oh, damn, there's like a flood in this place. And most people here, the housing stock isn't great. So everyone's basements are flooding. So I feel like the awareness helps, the social media helps so people can upload photos and videos. But we've lived with it for some time. It's just now that we can't ignore it, we have to actually look at it in the face, at least in wealthier parts of the US and wealthier parts of the world.
mhm. And I, for me, because I am in the tech space, I see the really big boom in the climate tech space. And I know from our conversation last time, we were talking about how all of these companies are coming up and saying that we have this solution for climate change.
Mhm.
And I know that you mentioned something along the lines of you're reading through like their homepage and you're just frustrated because you're like, I don't even know what your solution is because you're not telling me. Can you dive in deeper to that? Because now I can see that now there are these economic and business impacts going into this field. So what is something that, like on your take, is like what you would want to see for the future of climate tech and in business in general?
I want to see more transparency on like is this solution, can this scale? Like, is this right now a prototype? Is this like a hope that is possible? Or like, I would just like to see websites or any explainer just kind of be like, this is not up to scale. It's a good idea if if it can be scaled up. And I think some, like, of course companies have to promote themselves. Like, I don't blame them for that. That's part of like doing business. It's more so wanting to know early, like, how can you scale this? Can you scale this? Do you know when you'll be able to scale this?
Mm-hmm.
It's also, we see solutions, theoretical ones. I've written about like theory solutions, or where it's like, oh, this in theory, if we can ever get the technology for it, sounds like a good idea. And those are cool to learn about too, because we need someone who's out there saying, like, here's this fantastical idea. Once upon a time, the technology we're using right now was someone's fantastical idea. The fact that we're on Wi-Fi, on laptops, on devices that, like, 30 years ago, no one really had. And now so many people have them in their homes. So having the fantastical idea isn't the problem. It's like, okay, where's the action behind testing that this can be done? And I also just want to know more from different companies, like, are there regulations? Because we see sometime last year, the European Union kind of proposed like we need to put regulations on geoengineering. And for those who don't know, geoengineering is like you're using tech and science to alter the atmosphere, to alter the weather. Like when you hear about places putting chemicals in the clouds to make it snow, to make it rain because they're having drought, that is one example of geoengineering. But you're messing around with chemicals. And so like there might not be a lasting effect for some of the things that are currently regulated or currently allowed to happen. But a company might come up with a solution that we don't have the regulations for yet. We don't know the long-term effects about that yet. So I think they need to be transparent on, how are you testing this? How are you checking for safety? How are you ensuring that, like, yes, maybe this will help one aspect of nature, but what is it going to do to the rest of that natural environment? So it's a lot of questions that need to be answered.
Yeah.
And sometimes you answer the questions by doing, sometimes there's no other way, but it's like, what are the safety precautions while you're experimenting? How are workers being kept safe? How is the natural environment being kept safe? And I think that's interesting when we see entities like the European Union putting out there, like, we want geoengineering. We think that could be part of a solution to climate issues, but we need to make sure people are safe. We need to make sure the natural environment is safe from testing.
Mm-hmm. How do you feel about geoengineering?
Uh, I think it's cool with regulation. I think that we need to look at as many solutions as possible for stopping the worst of the climate crisis. But one of the best things that we can do that is within reason is lowering emissions. We can't just go like full throttle geoengineering without doing all of the other things first. Like, it shouldn't be, I personally don't feel that it should be the first resort. People that I've interviewed, that I've spoken to, have also pointed out specifically, like, this is something that can be paired with other things. This isn't the only solution we're touting right now. We're saying lower emissions, phase out of some of our fossil fuel infrastructure, find other ways to lower the impact while also using geoengineering. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm interested to see what's going to happen in that space in terms of regulations, but we need to exhaust as many other options too.
Yeah. And before, you also mentioned like other theories that you find interesting. So what other theories do you find interesting?
Like, there have been some really crazy ideas from geoengineering. Like, one that was reported on last year was, you put kind of like a kite on a comet, and the comet gets into kind of like the Earth's rotation and covering enough of sun from getting onto the planet that can help lower ambient temperatures. And I'm like, that's insane. That's really cool that someone
Yeah.
thought of that. However, like, how much would that cost? What materials can withstand that? Like, how are they going to be built? How is it going to get into space? How's that? Who's manufacturing that?
Yeah.
Like, what robot or what drone needs to be used to make sure that the thing is attached to the comet? How do you even, like, it feels very much like sci-fi movie, where it's like, how do you, like, the comet shows up, like where do we get it? There's like
Yeah.
so many questions.
The comet store.
Yeah, it's like and yes, we have comets coming into like our solar system and just like the system that we're currently in with planets, but yeah, I think it brings up more questions once you hear it, and I think it's cool that it's an idea, and
Yeah.
if it's ever possible, that's great. But what else? What else can you pair with that? What else are we doing? How else are we phasing out of issues that could worsen, like the climate crisis? Because we know we need to lower our emissions. We know we need to change parts of our systems, and a kite or like some sort of like sail on a comet is cool, but what else can we do? Where else can we put our innovation and like creativity?
Yeah, exactly. What keeps coming up for me is while you're speaking is from like I really want to understand like what how to frame the mindset of people like entrepreneurs, people that are in startups creating businesses like this because like I can see like an example that keeps coming up in my brain is like now we're getting into electric cars and electric vehicles and people are like, oh my gosh, this is so great for the environment, and then people are like, no wait, the battery for this like is so bad for the environment and does worse things than a car with gas. But also I
Mhm.
don't know because all the things I read are so conflicting. And what are some things that you want people that are going to make these business like what do you want them to think and consider?
Yeah, for starters, do consider the human rights impact of things like lithium, of like just any mineral that is going to be used to create these rechargeable vehicles. I personally want a high speed rail so bad. Just like any sort of mass transit rail. So many countries have managed to figure out more train systems, more bus systems, and I think that we could get away with using fewer minerals if more cities, more states had interconnectivity with like train and bus systems where you're moving more people per vehicle. Because if that bus, if that car, if that train is using minerals, can we move as many people as humanly possible from the amount that we're using instead of making the solution be individual vehicles? That's not to say that EVs aren't great or that EVs aren't going to lower like our car related emissions, but what else? Like I think to every solution that I see, I'm constantly thinking, what else, or what is the public way of moving people? And I think this is just kind of part of how the US works, where individualism leads to car centric travel. We have a big history of, like culture, books, movies, music about being on the open highway. There's so much iconic music that is about a car. Yeah, or just like the Grammys was like recently, and we had Luke Combs and Tracy Chapman singing Fast Car, and that's like one of her most iconic songs, and her music is really beautiful and about nativism and generational poverty in the US. And a lot of those songs about escapism and escaping poverty, it's a car. But that's also why I like songs where it's like took the midnight train going anywhere. I'm like, yes, the train. Get on the train.
Talk about the train, please.
Yeah, I'm like I need more trains. And so there's like a lot of iconic movie and literature and stuff that's either about cars, buses, and trains, and I'm pushing the trains pretty hard because I take public transit in New York City. It's better than other systems in like maybe the States, but it could be so much better than it is. It
Hmm.
could be cheaper than it is. It could have more escalators and elevators than it currently does. And I think part of kind of lowering the material use, lowering the mineral use is trying to think about like, okay, so if we're going to extract this, how many people can be moved from this extraction? How many vehicles that move a lot of people can be made from this extraction? Not just individual cars, but buses and trains, not just like,
Hmm.
I want us to think of it more holistically because, like I said, having EVs is better than having gas powered cars in terms of like air pollution, but what else? Like why does the imagination stop at EVs? when there's more that we can do.
Hmm. And so you keep bringing up the train. So the train is better, like, from a climate standpoint.
It's a lot of it is about like anything, like whether it's the cleaning, the energy used, all of that can create emissions, but per capita, can we lower it? And using mass transit lowers those emissions per person in use.
Hmm.
So I personally just also feel like a connected society, a functioning society, wants cleaner transportation and transportation that serves more people. Because growing up in New York, people who cannot see, people who are in wheelchairs, people who have their children in strollers can have some access to public transportation here. If they cannot use a car, they have the bus, they have the train. Once again, like I said, it's not the most accessible. A lot of train stations don't have escalators and elevators, but I like injured, like I fractured an ankle a few years ago, and I was able to still physically get to work because the train station by me has an elevator and an escalator, and so did the train station that I got out of.
Hmm.
So having that mobility for as many people as possible for lower emissions per capita, I think can make a huge difference, and not just in air pollution, in traffic and gridlock, but also people who can't drive, people who cannot afford a car, people who like their life would be changed if they had to pay less in gas money,
Yeah.
especially with inflation and how our cost of living has skyrocketed. Public infrastructure is important because more people use it per capita. And I'm like, I support a lot of public infrastructure, I support public use of things. And that can also be a vehicle for sustainability and resilience. For example, public libraries in New York City, if the temperature was too high and my parents were worried about the electricity bill, I would spend a lot of my day at a public library because they count as cooling centers in the city.
Mm.
So defunding public libraries, I think, could hurt resiliency in poor communities where people are struggling with dealing with excess heat and heat waves in the summer.
Yeah.
So it's just like, how can we extract less? And what we extract moves even more people, which is why like I love trains and buses.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. If anyone from the MTA is listening, you need to sponsor this podcast.
Why is it 290 MTA?
I know.
Bring it back to $2. That was a good time in my life. $10 was like 5 swipes. I was living the life. I really
Yeah.
was.
Yeah, it's insane now. And damn, I made my joke and I lost my train of thought. But yeah, what I was gonna say was it came back. It, like, also, as we're continuing our conversation, I'm just like picking up on all these beautiful patterns of how, like, city planning is so intertwined with quality of life for people, as well as like how much now, like, as we continue to build out cities, like, climate needs to be like a huge proponent in that, and funding is huge right now.
Yeah, like the urban heat island effect is real. Having people in one location creates more heat as well.
Mm-hmm.
If we're going to have more people in cities, we need better resilience. We need to consider that people who work jobs outside need to be safe, need to have support for when they're working in really hot days, people who have long commutes, people who, like I said, we have to consider that in our current economy, in our current crisis, more and more Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. People who are working full time professional jobs are struggling with supporting themselves and having their basic needs. And so people are cutting off their lights. People are not using, they're maybe scared to purchase a better AC or a new AC because they can't afford it. Like affordability leads to complications when we have things like heat waves. And we have to consider that this like extreme heat is a silent killer because people die at home in silence. People die in private. And I think like heat is such a horrible killer. Like it's
Mm-hmm.
like considering that this is a lot of people who are going to have heat stroke and other health complications because of the heat,
Yeah.
or and then the other factor of like we have a healthcare crisis in this country. So if someone has heat stroke, has heat injury, can they afford to go to the hospital? Can they afford
Yeah.
to go to urgent care to get the treatment that they need or the interventions that they need? So like Climate crisis compounds other crises in this country and around the world. So if you are in poverty, if you're struggling, whereas maybe you weren't a few years ago, are you gonna not use your AC or your fan when it's really hot because it's peak hours and you're worried about getting like crazy charges on your light bill that you can't afford?
Mm-hmm.
And it's like I've seen the impacts of that. I've seen how frustrated people can get when they're like, this is a basic need that I have and I can't even provide that. It's just
Yeah.
it's very disheartening. And elected officials, whether it's a city, a borough, a state, federally, need to consider that our current financial crises are going to make the impacts of climate even worse for people.
Yeah, like even everything that I heard that went on this past summer with like Arizona,
Mm-hmm.
that was so shocking to me that all of that was going on.
Yeah, it's less resiliency for hurricanes as well. People can't afford to fix what's wrong with their house. They can't afford to replace the things that they lost. So having different agencies, different elected officials create as many barriers as they can between the worst of it could mean, somebody not practically going bankrupt when they're trying to
Mm-hmm.
replace items or replace like important things that they lose in a storm or in other climate or extreme weather related catastrophes.
Government,
Mm-hmm.
how, and I know that also within how we see changes where the money talks. How would you like to see the future of how startups and businesses and politicians all work with each other? Because I know that's all intertwined between making sustainable solutions within climate tech.
I think if climate tech can make something like can create solutions, whether it's like this item is going to last a long time and be used, so if somebody pays for it once, they're not worried about constant replacement. A lot of people love things like heat pumps because it uses less energy than a conventional boiler, but can keep a house warm, can keep a house cool. And so we're looking at like, but then there's the issue of, can the person who owns a property afford to have a heat pump put in?
Mm-hmm.
Can average families afford that when their mortgages have gone up, when interest rates have gone up, when taxes have gone up? It's a lot of the solution is cool, but who can afford that? The
Yeah.
solution is cool, but can elected officials create like funding programs where it's like, okay, this usually costs 3,000 or 4,000 to replace. Can there be a grant where people are getting an extra grand or 2 grand to support that kind of like update to their home? Because the average American does not have thousands of dollars right now. They
Yeah.
have not in some time. Like, I think we talk a lot about inflation and the pandemic, but like pre that time, many households, depending on the region of the country, were struggling. So we're just looking at how climate just compounds that and makes that, adds more complications to how people use their money and where they can't even use their money.
So I know I feel this way to get back into what we were talking about, and we could wrap it up with this point because I want to
Mm-hmm.
leave it off with, whenever I hear about climate change, it just feels like, and everything that's going on, everything that's packed into it, it's such a huge topic, and it feels like there's so much weight, and the even the more that um like I think about it, I'm just like, there's so much. I don't want this to happen anymore. And like there's a little bit of that impending like doom vibe.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to leave this off with like, positives that like you've seen of like people or organizations that are doing like really good work, that are like empowering the people that want to make a huge change in this space, that you're just like, yes, from my experience, they're doing the right things, like get inspired by them, like it's not doom, like we we can figure this out on like, yeah.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of really great local solutions happening state level, city level. Like there's a lot of there are people who see a gap and they do try their best to fill it. I've reported on this one kind of like org, Half Glass Full in New Orleans. They blew up on TikTok because that's how I found them. And there really isn't a lot of municipal glass recycling in that city. there are certain states that don't have very strict recycling laws or strict recycling like infrastructure. New York is very strict. I've always known recycling to be a thing, but then I visit family elsewhere and it's like, what do you mean you don't recycle your glass bottles? What do you mean you don't recycle like some of these plastics? These are recyclable. They have the it's on the label. And but then there's not always infrastructure for that. And so the people who started this organization, who used to be students, I think, at Tulane, uh, they started in their backyard and have since expanded to a warehouse over the last few years. They've won grants, they've done partnerships, they're using the glass that is recycled. They've tested it in natural environments to make sure that it can be used as sand because Louisiana is struggling with land erosion. They're losing so much land to sea level rise, erosion, and different swamplands have been deforested over the years. And so they're trying to kind of add native plants in that sand again to see, can we create certain buffers that used to naturally exist in this environment. And they've successfully have had several demos, and I've spoken to them about it and have done some
That's
reporting
so
on it.
cool.
Yeah, there's people who have the resources to start something or the connections. And I think it's a very good example of when somebody has certain connections, they can expand and work with other people and like expand their resources because the university has gotten involved, grants have gotten involved, communities that are struggling with land erosion have gotten involved. And so one solution kind of compounds and it has a ripple effect of like, okay, now we're bringing in this partner, we're bringing this other technology. We have this other partner now that is providing the tech for this or the resources for this. So I'm inspired every time I do a solution story because one thing does lead to another, one solution does help another solution. And so that's just one example. And there are so many community organizations that discuss different types of issues. They'll look at poverty and housing and then also acknowledge environmental racism. Like organizations that I've reported on, specifically in the South Bronx, have done a lot of work to educate people on their rights, particularly as people that struggle with exacerbated pollution and environmental racism, because that's like such a huge problem throughout New York City. But the South Bronx has that highway that cuts through it
Yeah.
and like that separates like and that brings so much like bus and car and like truck traffic that has worsened like allergies and asthma
Which
in that
highway is it?
community. I'm trying to remember the name. I used to have it all memorized. I had like a map in my head.
Oh, it's okay.
There's a I feel like learning about city planning can lead to people finding solutions or finding organizations that have pointed out the pitfalls of racist city planning. And it's also, I think, one of the ways in which I found some of these solutions, organizations, or have found inspiration from them is learning the history. Why is the highway there? Why does the map look like it does? Why do our transit systems look the way that
Yeah.
they do?
Hmm.
And for the sake of New York City, we had Robert Moses as a city planner.
Oh, yep. I live. Yep, I know that whole story.
There's like a really funny meme online where someone's like, F Robert Moses, all my homies hate Robert Moses. And I'm like, I joked to someone where I was like, if I die and hell is real, I'm fist fighting Robert Moses. Like we're square up Robert Moses. Like we're really.
I know. Like yeah, from cuz I grew up on Long Island. So that's yeah, the whole beaches the way they're set up here. Like I can literally tell like there's no public transportation to get to the beaches here other than the ones that are directly underneath like Brooklyn and parts of Queens.
That
And
was on purpose
yeah.
so that people of color and poor people could not go to the beach. And
Yep.
then beaches are a natural resource. I think everyone should have access to a beach, to a waterfront that
100%.
is safe.
Yeah.
And it like finding so like it's interesting to see the organizations, community orgs that have come out of these issues, the history of these issues, to try to like lower the negative impact and give people the vocabulary to express themselves when they feel like they have that they're part of the injustice. Like an organization I spoke to a lot when I was a college student reporting in the South Bronx was the Point CDC, because it's like the community of Hunts Point in the South Bronx specifically. But we did reporting in Mott Haven and Longwood as well, and other surrounding neighborhoods like I think Morrisania. But it really, learning the history of the issue, find a starting point and work your way out, and you'll find organizations, you'll find solutions, because yes, it is a big topic. It intersects with so many things. It's global. Some days, as someone who deals with that every day, I also feel overwhelmed. I'm like, I don't even, someone would be like, oh, like, we want to write articles about this specific topic in climate. Do you have any pitches? And I'm like, I've never heard of this. Or like, I don't know much about that niche in climate reporting because there's so much to do.
Mhm.
And I'm trying to challenge myself to do more of that solutions reporting, because it really is more uplifting and inspiring to see the solution versus just the analysis of the problem. So I'm trying to lean into that more, but there's a lot of great stuff out there if people look at it. There's also, I encourage everyone, where are you right now? Look at the climate issues that impact your community today, right now, like your city, your state, your borough, your county. What is happening? How is climate impacting you? And why? Like, is there a history of a racist city planner who was like, I don't want any brown people here. Like,
Bobby Moses, what are you doing?
he's just like, he's like the he looked around. Yeah, he looked around the city. He's like, too many Hispanics. Like, he really, it's so interesting to see how someone is like, oh, but like, he was a product of the time. I'm like, yes, but also people still knew that that was messed up then.
Yeah.
People protested some of these highways even then. Eminent domain and displacement of people for those highways was seen as bad even back then.
Yeah.
And so learn the history of why the issue is happening in your community, in your state, or
Yeah.
in your borough, or wherever you happen to live. What, like, who is standing up about it? Who is not? Why does it look the way it look? How is it going to impact your household? Do you know how it's going to impact your household? So it's like, you start off small and use that to build a vocabulary and a lexicon of knowledge, because yes, it's hard, it's complicated. Like, talking to scientists, reading like scientific reports and looking at these graphs, like, when I first started doing this, I was terrified of looking at scientific reports. I was like, I don't know what's happening, I don't know what's going on.
Yeah, I can only
you
imagine.
you take little bites, you take
Yeah.
little chunks of the information, and then ask yourself, like, do I know what this actually means? Yes, okay, on to the next piece of information. But starting somewhere and admitting to yourself, like, all the things you don't know is the best way, because there's so much I had to admit to myself. There's so much I don't know, so much I want to know. I'm starting here, I'm working my way out. And it takes all of us to not just recycle more and do things, but when you have a vocabulary, you can call out your elected officials. When you have a vocabulary, you can report a violation in housing or something with city planning that you think is a danger to other people. When you have the knowledge and vocabulary, you can connect issues like defunding public libraries, defunding like cooling centers, when we're seeing higher and higher temperatures. 2023 saw one of the hottest days in the world. Countries were reporting their hottest day ever globally.
Mhm.
We need cooling centers. We need solutions. We need elected officials who have the moral backbone and the will to really say, this is what we're willing to fund to support people. And if you know where to look for that information, it's easier for you to say, this is right or this is wrong, or this is going to screw over my community, and how it's going to screw over your community. So bits and pieces, taking little steps forward, is how I started and how I explain it to other people. Because yes, I still am intimidated every day, but you can do it scared. And I have been doing this scared,
Mhm.
and doing this anxious, and doing this like with a sense of hesitation and trepidation, have still managed to have bylines and make a career out of this, even though journalism is it's hard and it's challenging. And but somehow I'm still here, and I'm very grateful to be here.
Thank you so much. This was awesome. Do you have anything that you want to mention before we wrap up, that like you're working on, you're promoting, anything before we end? If not, you could tell people where to connect with you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, people can find more of my work either on my LinkedIn, where I share a lot, or my Instagram, which is just Angely_Mercado. And my goal this year is to promote myself a bit more, maybe just start making videos and more content online to kind of share my work and share what I've learned through my reporting. But So many people have engaged with me online so far, and I really appreciate them.
Thank you so much. I could cry. This is awesome.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. Goodbye, everyone. Now.